Hello and welcome to the Centre for Brexit Studies YouTube channel. I'm joined by our director, Professor Alex de Ruyter today. So Alex, this week, it's been a while actually since we've seen anything quite like this. Could you briefly talk us through what votes have been taking place and why?
Thanks, Beth. Yes, of course, with Parliament having reconvened after the summer recess and Prime Minister Boriss Johnson determined to pursue Brexit by the 31st of October, come what may, set itself quite starkly for a showdown in terms of the PM's manifest desire, to all intents and purposes, to leave with no deal if needs be. Now, of course, up until this point, there'd been a little bit of a hiatus, of course, with the summer recess, and before that, of course, his predecessor having tried 3 times to get a withdrawal agreement through Parliament and failing. What Parliament had shown there, of course, was that they were deeply divided in terms of what options the UK should pursue going forward, but what they were resolutely, for the most part, of one voice on was the determination not to leave the EU with no deal. And it was only when, of course, the Prime Minister seriously started touting this as a possibility, leaving come what may, and over his dead body asking for an extension of membership beyond the 31st of October, that this served as a galvanising factor, particularly when the Prime Minister then went to the Queen to ask for Parliament to be suspended or prorogued for a 5-week period in the lead up to the end of October. This was the last straw for MPs, and to them it emphasised the urgency of needing to overcome their traditional divisions and rivalries and act together as they saw it to avert no deal. So we saw progress through Parliament this week, a motion put forward by Hilary Benn, in essence seeking to stop no deal and committing the government, in effect the Prime Minister, to ask for an extension from Brussels to our period of EU membership to the 31st of January next year, or a longer period if Brussels wanted to offer one, which in turn then would need to be ratified by Parliament here, or unless the Prime Minister could come up with a modified agreement for Parliament by the 19th of October. Now, coincidentally, Boriss Johnson, having prorogued Parliament, has kind of shot himself in the foot in that regard, because he is denying himself sitting time for any new agreement to be approved. So this is what we've had. We've had an amendment, we've had a bill put forward to commit the government to seeking an extension to EU membership. Now, the Prime Minister doesn't want to do this, of course, so he is trying desperately to come up with a way to push for an election for October the 15th. And in essence, the opposition party's been asked to take him on trust that he would abide by any commitment to hold an election then and not move it once Parliament were suspended. So when the Prime Minister then put his motion for an election to Parliament the first time round, it was rejected again because of lack of trust in the Prime Minister's motives. What was most notable out of this process, of course, was the voting against the government of 21 Tory MPs in support of the Benn Amendment, who were subsequently expelled from the party, had the withdrawn is the technical term, and this included notaries such as Ken Clarke, Philip Hammond, David Gauke, all people with senior cabinet experience. So these particular Tories now are part of the opposition alliance, to use a phrase coined by the SNP's leader in Parliament, Ian Blackford. So high drama indeed, and we now await to see what happens next week when the government try again to force an election, and Labor saying they will hold out against one until the no-deal scenario has been removed from the table.
You've just said about drama, so obviously there's been lots of drama in Parliament this week. So we've had the former Tory MP Philip Lee actually walking across the floor to join the Lib Dems. 21 Tory Rebels have had their whip removed, and Joe Johnson, the Prime Minister's brother, even he's quit. What is going on with the Tories?
Well, I think what Brexit has done is to expose the fundamental contradictions and divisions within the Conservative Party. You know, the Conservative Party and the Labour Party have always been broad churches, to use the phrase, but Brexit has tested these traditional loyalties to breaking point. And whilst there is a Labour Leave strand out there and a third of Labour voters voted Leave, you don't see that tension within the Labour Party. Only a handful of Labour MPs are avowedly pro-Brexit. Whereas in the Conservative Party, of course, that split is much more down the middle. So you have the hardcore, the so-called European Research Group of MPs who are strongly pro-Brexit, people like Jacob Rees-Mogg and Steve Baker, Mark Francois, people who would rather leave the EU, it seems, with no agreement than risk what they regard as being a vassal state through a more or less de facto customs union or whatever. Brexit has exposed the divisions in the Tory party down the middle between those who are socially liberal, economically liberal and outward looking, and those who regard sovereignty and national identity as being an overriding imperative, so-called English nationalists. They haven't been helped in this regard by Nigel Farage and his resurgence with his Brexit party snapping at their heels from the right, so to speak. So they're caught in the middle. They're caught between the economically and socially liberal moderate Tories, with the Lib Dems snapping on their heels from the left-hand side, and the nativist nationalists, as represented by Nigel Farage and his ilk on the right. So these tensions are now being laid bare through the Brexit process, and we are seeing the Conservative Party, I don't want to say implode, maybe that's too strong a word, but withdrawing the whip from 21 of your own MPs and people of such distinguished service is alienating a big chunk of the Conservative tradition, and the party might yet pay a price in any forthcoming election.
So the Tory Rebels, which obviously included Ken Clarke, Philip Hammond, Dominic Grieve, Justine Greening, Margot James, what do they do now? Do you think they'll stand as independents, possibly join another party, or will they actually end up being reinstated?
Well, there's no reason why they couldn't be reinstated other than the fact that under Boris Johnson's leadership and with the being enthralled to the advice of Dominic Cummings, the so-called Vote Leave Svengali, playing a sort of Rasputin role, if you like, to the Tsar Boriss, it marks a real turning, I think, in the Conservative Party becoming a lot more intolerant and authoritarian in terms of the party line on Brexit. So I think certainly within the current strictures of Johnson's PMship and the line he's pushing, it makes it very difficult for them to rejoin. I don't know what the legalities are of being deselected. Philip Hammond seems to think he can still contest as a Conservative and he will fight it in the courts if need be. But it certainly does draw a line down the middle between a group of moderate Conservatives and the bulk of the party at this point, which are embracing the government's stance. So, there's been a lot of jokey remarks on social media about what do they call themselves, provisional Conservatives, progressive Conservatives, what? Doesn't really matter. They are there as a bloc in Parliament. The interesting thing, of course, will be what happens, if we get an election soon. Ostensibly, if they're not readmitted into the party fold, they would have to stand as independents. So for some of them, maybe Margot James in Stourbridge, it's in these strongly Leave voting areas, it's difficult to see her surviving in that capacity. Others, maybe such as a Ken Clarke or a Philip Hammond, with a certain ministerial pedigree and experience, they may attract enough clout as independents to stand on that basis. Or maybe some of them will think of joining the Lib Dems, as Dr. Philip Lee already has. That is distinctly possible as well. Who knows? But there is a moderate Tory bloc there, and there's certainly a moderate Tory vote out there.
So, of course, the topic on everyone's lips, especially this week, has been general election. Can we expect one next month? And if so, who do you think would come out on top?
Well, that's a good question, isn't it? Is that an easy one to answer? In one sense, yes. In another, no. It's easy to answer in the sense that the Labor Party are holding the line that they will not support an October 15th poll, and their stance is that they will not support an election until they are satisfied that no deal is taken off the table, for this year at least. In other words, in my mind, that would mean the government being forced to ask Brussels for an extension to the 31st of January, and Brussels then offering an extension of some length that would take us beyond this immediate year. Now, if that happens, then we end up in a situation whereby Boris Johnson, assuming he stays on as leader of the Conservative Party, he might decide resigning is preferable than being forced into a position where he has to ask for an extension over his dead body, so to speak, lying dead in a ditch. If we still find ourselves in the EU come Christmas and we find ourselves contesting an election in November, he will have been seen by a good chunk of the electorate to have failed in his central promise to deliver Brexit come what may by October 31st. Now, what effect will that have? It might embolden the Faragists, to stand candidates against the Conservatives and thereby split the right-wing vote, the Brexit vote. And of course, if they continue to maintain that strongly Leave come what may line, they will risk alienating further moderate Conservative voters, who in the guise of the Lib Dems have a seemingly ready alternative they can turn to. And indeed that may well happen in areas like the South Midlands, Worcester, Malvern Hills, some affluent areas in the outskirts of Birmingham like Solihull, these sorts of areas where there's a sort of big middle class stroke professional vote. The Lib Dems may do well in those areas, and they might do well in the southwest, they may do well in the home counties for similar reasons. So there are a lot of risks involved in the Tories, having an election at all. It is distinctly possible that, if they stay too far to the right, they'll alienate the moderate vote. If they move away from their hard Brexit stance and they get the Farages splitting the vote by standing candidates against them, no certainty that they would win. Whereas the arithmetic for Labour, well, they have a slightly different problem. Until now, they've prevaricated on their Brexit stance. Will they promise another referendum? Won't they? Are they avowedly pro-Remain, or are they still touting some form of soft Brexit? And of course, their position in the polls had suffered as a result. I mean, we had seen people, shift their voting intention away from Labour to the Lib Dems. So that the last YouGov poll that was conducted a few days ago had Labour and the Lib Dems neck and neck. Will that split the Remain vote? Difficult to say. The more Labour come off the fence with regards to Brexit, and Corbyn is, rediscovering his mojo and really pushing it against no deal. Maybe that will reflect itself in the ballot box with an improved Labour vote share. These are the intangibles. Is it true that Remain voters may be more tactical in their voting intentions than Leave voters? Who knows? The local authority by-elections we've seen to date suggest that the Lib Dems are still doing well as a protest vote vehicle. But I don't think it's a certainty that Boris Johnson would win an election, far from it. If you're only polling about 33% of the nationwide voting intention, that's nowhere near enough in my mind to comfortably assume you can win.
So there's been lots of discussion around Jeremy Corbyn's performance in this week's PMQs, with many saying that he actually came across very well. What's given him this push? And could this help if an election were to go ahead?
Well, at the risk of sounding blunt and cruel, I think Corbyn has been helped immensely by the fact that his opponent is notorious for not reading briefing materials or ad-libbing or just trying to have a conversation as he goes along. And of course, if you are asked simple questions and you repeatedly refuse to answer them or are unable to answer them, for example, what preparations is the government undertaking for no deal? Can the government detail what negotiations are taking place with the European Union in Brussels at this point? And you fail to provide answers for these questions, or you make basic factual errors, even a relatively staid opponent asking questions in a dry manner can really expose you for being deficient in key areas. And I think this has been one of the key problems for Boriss, is that whilst he may appear to be an excellent campaigner, he may be seen to, by the party or the bulk of the party, certainly the members, to have this charisma. Theatre only gets you so far, and in his capacity as Prime Minister, it's not enough to be a campaigner, he has to govern.
And the Lib Dems, so obviously this week they've had former Tory MP Philip Lee join them, as well as Luciana Berger. What will the party be thinking now?
Well, the Lib Dems, of course, with their unambiguous pro-Europe stance, pro-EU stance, remain in the European Union. Certainly as the polls stand, and these couple of by-elections have shown in local authorities in Cumbria and Coventry, of course, they've benefited from that at the expense of Labour thus far, because Labour have been sort of trying to cover two bases, whereas the Lib Dems have been resent and you remain. And the polls still suggest that. So where I think they may benefit is not so much in continuing to draw support away from Labour. I think that if Labour galvanise their Brexit stance and firm up on a commitment to another referendum, for example, as part of an election manifesto with Remain on the table, then I think some of that protest vote will dissipate and go back to Labour. But where I think the Lib Dems have a clear opportunity now is to soak up that moderate Tory vote, which is why I think they will do well in areas on the outskirts of London, like the home counties, the southern Midlands, parts of the southwest. They will do well in those sort of more affluent professional areas where people may have voted Tory because they were seen as the party of economic competence or pro-business, pro-market. That's the opportunity for the Lib Dems.
Thank you, Alex.